Good morning, everyone. How are you all this morning? So my name is Elisa Valentine, and I am the Communications Justice Fellow at Public Knowledge. And I am proud to say that I have led and organized this year's Emerging Tech for Social Change event alongside my wonderful colleagues at Public Knowledge. I'm so thrilled that you all could join us here today in person as well as online. We're streaming live right now, so if you guys can't stay the whole day, you can always watch it online. And I want to begin by thanking Congressman Mark Takano. We are here today because of his leadership on these issues. And I also want to thank his wonderful, hardworking staffers, including Emily Paul, who worked with us, and she serves currently as his Tech Congress Fellow. I also want to thank our very generous sponsors, Google, as well as the Internet Association, for making this event possible today on the Hill, as well as our reception and showcase tonight at the Google DC office. And because I don't want to make any assumptions about what people know or who people know, I want to begin by telling you all a little bit about Public Knowledge and the history of this event. Public Knowledge is a consumer advocacy organization here in DC, and we work to promote freedom of expression, an open internet, and access to affordable communications tools and creative works. We work to shape policy on behalf of the public interest. Some of you probably remember when this event was branded as 3D DC, which was an event similar to this except it focused specifically on the wonders of 3D printing. In 2018, this event was rebranded as Emerging Tech DC so that we can include policy discussions about the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, as well as virtual reality. And now in 2019, we have Emerging Tech for Social Change. And as I stated earlier, I had a little something to do with this in my role as a Communications Justice Fellow. No matter what issues we focus on at Public Knowledge, whether that's about expanding broadband access, intellectual property, platform competition, artificial intelligence, or data privacy, it is my job to approach these issues from a social justice perspective. And it's a pretty amazing and impactful role, but I also feel as though it's my responsibility. Not only to myself, but to people who look like me, who came before me, as well as people who look like me who will be here long after me. I believe technology can be used for social change. And I believe there must be regulations in place to ensure that change is something that's positive and beneficial, especially for our most marginalized communities. We haven't always made the right decisions in the tech space, and we've suffered serious repercussions because of it. #privacy. But we can't give up in the fight for equity in this space. And I'll tell you right now that I'm not going to give up. I'm a Valentine, I'm a Black Latina from Tifton, Georgia. I went to Howard, so it's just not in my DNA to give up. So I hope that everyone in this room fights alongside me and our esteemed panelists and our showcase participants as we work to center voices at the margins, uplift people who have been held down for far too long, and empower communities that have been disempowered. And I want to be clear, I don't think we're always going to get things right when it comes to tech, but we sure can make a concerted effort to do so. And we must ensure that those who have been most oppressed in society are the same people who lead the conversations about equity and justice in tech. And with that being said, welcome to Emerging Tech for Social Change. So before we move on, I have a couple of housekeeping items. So if you want to access today's schedule of events, please use the QR code. We have it listed in the back. Oops, sorry. And we also have it on our Eventbrite page as well. We're trying to go green today, you all. We will break for lunch at 12:40, so you can head over to the cafeteria here Or if you feel like making the trek to Rayburn to get and pizza, you can do that as well, but it might take you a while to get back in. But just make sure that you're back here at 1:40. After we conclude here today, we would like to invite you to our showcase and reception at Google DC, which is located at 25 Massachusetts Avenue. It's about a 15-minute walk from here, depending on how fast you walk. But if you don't want to walk, if it's hot by that time, you can always take a ride share or a cab. And if you have any questions, you can talk to one of the PK staffers here. Can the PK folks raise their hands so people know who they can ask questions to? All right, so we have these folks. I think we have some folks outside as well. And lastly, be sure to use hashtag #TechForChange for all of your tweets and social media posts. We encourage you to take photos and share your thoughts about today's event. And we really want you all to stay engaged online, especially the people who are watching online. All right, so I think we're going to go ahead and invite our panelists up here for our first panel because we're waiting for Congressman Takano to get here. And never mind, I think they're walking in. But the panelists can go ahead. If you guys want to go ahead and sit up here, you can. Feel free. Megan, where's Megan now? You can go ahead and make your way where we can be settled. So as I said before, Congressman Mark Takano sponsored this event for us, and he's the reason that we're here. And again, thank you to Emily Paul for all of her hard work. Congressman Mark Takano represents California's 41st Congressional District. Congressman Takano serves as the co-chair of the Congressional Maker Caucus, and he is a huge fan of 3D printing and how it can change and impact manufacturing as well as entrepreneurship. And we are thrilled to have a representative here who leads in that space. And beyond his work in tech, we are thrilled to have a member of Congress who understands and advocates for marginalized communities in all spaces, because that's what the conversations here are about here today. Without further ado, please welcome Congressman Mark Takano to the stage.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm Congressman Mark Takano. I represent the 41st Congressional District in California, and I'd like to start by commending Public Knowledge for bringing together a diverse group of people to talk about emerging technology here in the Capitol today. And as one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Maker Caucus and an advocate in Congress for sharing the benefits of new technologies, I'm excited, really excited to be here to help kick off the Emerging Tech for Social Change event today. Now, there's been a lot of talk in Congress, and rightfully so, about the harms of technology, whether it's the violations of people's privacy to misinformation, and the spread of hate online, hate speech. These are important and necessary discussions, but they aren't the full story of what Congress is doing on technology. And that's why it's so refreshing to have an event like this today, an event focused not only on how to address potential harms of technology, but also on the ways that technology can contribute to our well-being as individuals and well-being as a society. Now, most advances in technology are not inherently harmful or beneficial. But what we see happen too often is that the decisions on how to use these new technologies are made by a small and privileged group of people. And because of this, the potential for innovations to discriminate and exclude can be overlooked. And that's why I'm happy to see today's event focused on the ways technology affects, the ways in which technology affects and can benefit communities I am a part of and care deeply about. People of color, LGBTQ people, veterans, people with disabilities, and the working class. These communities are an amazing source of creativity and innovation, but they're not always given a seat at the table when decisions are made about how new technologies should be used. And that needs to change. They need to be in the room where it happens. Today, you'll be hearing about emerging technology, including virtual reality and 3D printing, And you'll be having important discussions about how we can promote inclusive uses of these technologies. Before that, I want to share a few applications of emerging technology that I find exciting. The first is related to the use of virtual reality, otherwise known as VR. I work closely with many of our veterans, and in my district in Riverside, as well as veterans living across our country and around the world. And one inspiring effort that shows the benefits of emerging technologies is the use of virtual reality to help veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Over 20 years ago, researchers at Georgia Tech first tried using virtual reality to help treat PTSD. And since then, virtual reality has been used in numerous PTSD studies and is currently in use at several of our VA facilities. I've actually visited one not far from here. And it's interesting to just walk through this virtual reality, or not walking through it, but the virtual reality is just sort of happening around you. It is new technology, and a group of people with an in-depth understanding of an issue affecting the community. And they were able to apply this VR technology to really make a difference. Another emerging technology I'm interested in is 3D printing, as you've heard before. And many of you know that we actually have a 3D printer right in my congressional office. There's a bust of me that somebody sent me. The program is somewhere online. There's an online program that you can actually just print out the computer, a bust of me. We keep it on this shelf, but sometimes we use that shelf as a backdrop to do videos, but we are always careful to take it down, put it aside, because there are online viewers out there, many of whom don't like me that much. I'm sure they'll key in on, what does this guy have a bust of himself? But it's a discussion piece, right? It's like, what is that? And it's actually just see me going. Well, there's a makerspace in my own district called Vocademy. I've been excited about the ways in which 3D printing and the maker movement about the ways in which 3D printing and the maker movement more broadly empower a diverse group of people to use their creativity to be active participants in innovation in the communities. And Gene, who owns Vocademy, Gene Sherman, he had visions of helping engineering students gain the practical machining skills that they don't get when they go to engineering school. They learn highly theoretical stuff. But what was interesting to him, what was interesting to me, is that what people come into his makerspace do is they make costumes for Comic-Con, and very elaborate costumes. And it's everything from the plastic molded helmets to the very fine leatherwork, a futuristic, sci-fi, designs that you might see in the movie set. That's what a lot of people were using this makerspace to produce. Well, just last week, I was at a VA facility in Seattle and saw how they're using 3D printers to print actual medical devices, like custom orthotics for people with diabetes. I'd seen a lot of work that the VA had done with printing prosthetics, but this orthotics was a very web-like material, very flexible, and people with, many of you might know that diabetes is one of the largest causes for people to lose their limbs, right, their extremities. And these orthotics were designed to help ease some of the stress of the sores on their feet, and it's made out of this very flexible material. And as you know, 3D printing allows for a lot of customization. So when someone's device or someone's orthotic breaks down or wears down, the VA can just reprint it and ship it to them, saving a lot of money. And actually, it's a product that's probably not as generally available. Using these emerging technologies for social good isn't just about healthcare, it's also about creativity and expression. As a former public school teacher, I see the potential for the maker movement to empower students to design and build things themselves. Not just students, all sorts of people in the economy. And I've been trying to get my friend for years, who was left behind by the last recession, never really got back on his feet, just to go and tinker around in a maker space, because they're very non-threatening places where you're not graded on things. You can just go and tinker around and learn how to do things and learn how these new technologies work. So I see the potential for the maker movement to empower everybody to build things for themselves. This to me is a crucial part of the effort to ensure that everyone is able to access the tools they need to create and innovate and help shape how we use new technologies in an equitable way. By involving diverse voices in the design of new technologies, we can move closer to realizing the full potential of emerging technologies to benefit all of us. Well, thank you all for being here today and being involved in this discussion, and good luck today. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Takano. All right, I'm going to introduce our first panel for today. We have Megan Stiefel here. Stiefel, not Stifle, you all. Megan is currently the Senior Policy Counsel at the Global Cyber Alliance. Until very recently, I think like in the last 2 weeks or so, she was PK's Cybersecurity Policy Director. Previously, Megan spent 8 years at the Department of Justice, and there she was the Director for Cyber Policy in the National Security Division, served as counsel in the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section of the Criminal Division, and began her DOJ career as an attorney in the Office of Intelligence. We are thrilled to have Megan here to join us as she moderates our first panel of the morning, Emerging Privacy and Security Threats in Consumer IoT, Protecting Consumers to Drive Social Change.
Thank you, Elisa. Did I get, okay, close enough, but not too close. Good morning, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Elisa, and the team at PK for putting this event together. I think it is incredibly timely, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to participate. So our plan for this morning is hopefully not to scare you away from all of the great things that Congressman Takano just talked about with emerging technologies like 3D printers and the like, but to help sort of inform the conversation as we think about how all of these technologies can enhance our lives. And I think most of us on the panel could agree that it starts with security and privacy. So our goal is to help inform the conversation about how we can best address those challenges and interests as we develop additional emerging tech for change. So we're going to quickly introduce ourselves, and then we'll move into some questions. We've saved time at the end for questions, but if there's something that's burning, perhaps you can stand up, and I think we have a mic if there are questions. So we'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then look forward to talking with all of you about some questions. So I'll turn it to Dr. Eswick first.
Good morning. Thank you, PK, for the invitation. I'm currently the director for the National Cybersecurity Institute at Excelsior College. Excelsior College is an online educational institution catering to adult learners. I'm also the director for their cybersecurity program, and also I come from really a background of 20 years being in the intelligence community. I spent 8 years serving in the United States Army and what we call information security. It wasn't cybersecurity back then, and telecommunications, and then about 17 years at the National Security Agency, where I held a multitude of technical positions from computer science researcher to, before I left there in 2016, technical director in their NSA's Cybersecurity Threat Operations Center. So thank you for having me.
Hi, good morning. My name is Adam Sedgwick. I'm a policy advisor at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. NIST is part of the Department of Commerce. We're the technical arm of the Department of Commerce. We're actually a national laboratory program, but unlike a lot of the other national laboratories, our focus is all on industry teams. And we're also a measurement agency, so everything we do is focused on, that's where the standards come in. Everything we do is supposed to be focused on measurement, so we do things like maintain the atomic clock that synchronizes all of your cell phones and all of your computers. On cybersecurity, we develop standards and guidelines for information systems, so we really help the federal government, but also help industry on how do you use technology, old technology, and emerging technology like IoT.
Hello, I'm Harley Geiger, and I'm Director of Public Policy at Rapid7. Rapid7 is a cybersecurity firm. It's based out of Boston. We've got about 1,300 employees and about 7,800 customers. We sell a variety of cybersecurity software tools as well as services. So we will hack you for money, and we will also sometimes hack you not for money and tell you what your vulnerabilities are. We do a fair amount of independent research, including on IoT, and work with manufacturers to try to patch them.
Great. Maybe I'll use this is working. No, it's not. Okay, never mind. Won't use that. Okay, so I just wanted to give everyone a background very, very briefly about the work that Public Knowledge has done on cybersecurity. As Lisa mentioned, up until recently, I was the cybersecurity policy director there. We were, our work was supported by a generous grant from the Hewlett Foundation. Unfortunately, they changed their approach, and so I'm staying in the neighborhood, but not exactly in the same place at Public Knowledge. So what we really tried to do was to think about how cybersecurity, but better ways to talk about cybersecurity with consumers in particular. Obviously that includes the business space. So last spring we published a paper entitled Securing the Modern Economy, Transforming Cybersecurity Through Sustainability. And essentially the argument of the paper is the internet is an ecosystem. All elements of the ecosystem play a role in protecting it, advancing it, securing it, and using it. And at the end of the paper, we outlined a series of steps that a number of stakeholder groups could take to best secure themselves and contribute to a more sustainable internet ecosystem. Following on that work, earlier this year, we published a paper that advocated for something that is like security, the Energy Star for cybersecurity, entitled it Security Shield, thanks to Dylan, who's in the back, and others in PK for their great work on both of those efforts. And the idea around Energy Star and Security Shields is to think about ways to communicate to consumers how they can purchase an IoT product, a consumer-facing IoT product that has been built in the most secure manner possible and can be deployed in the most secure manner possible. We won't spend too much time today talking about that, I don't think, but we're happy to. Instead, I think what we should begin with first is to kind of set the table. What are Internet of Things? How do they differ from other security threats that we've talked about? For a long time, we all had desktops, and then we had laptops, and now we have processors on our phones that are stronger than what Amelia can tell us about what we had back when we sent the first person to the moon. How do we manage these new, fully capable devices in our lives, and how is that different than what we had 10, 20, 50 years ago? So I'll turn it to Amelia first.
Because I'm on the side, right? I go first. But so Internet of Things, we hear that term thrown around a lot, right? And basically is IoT, looking at devices that are connected via wirelessly or by cable to the internet, right? And things that can be controlled sometimes remotely, most of the times remotely. So I like to tell people all the time on a high level, right? Internet of Things, it's your smartwatch, right? It's folks have wireless cameras now around their homes. It's the thermostat that you want that also to control from your phone. We want the convenience to control everything by our phone, right? And it's become so pervasive in our society that I ran across a stat that said by 2020, meanwhile, I think I saw this stat about a year ago. So 2020 is next year, right? So by 2020, right, world population is supposed to be like 8 billion people, but IoT devices will be at over 36 billion, right? So that's 4 devices per every, human on Earth, basically. And I don't know about all of you, but I know I have more than 4 devices by myself, right? I think we all could probably speak to that. So it's one of these things that we definitely, of course, have to think about. We have to develop policies around and try to figure out how can we best mitigate cyber attacks against IoT.
Probably your avenue. Strategic differences, if any, between where we were and where we are.
No, not where we were. Not where we were, where we are. Just a couple of other thoughts on sort of the definition of IoT, what we conceive of it. And I think it's one of the challenges that you run into if you're looking at making policy around IoT is how to define it. Because in any sort of legislation, any sort of regulation, you have to define things very clearly because it's all going to end up in court. Every word will be scrutinized, right? And what we think of as IoT, like physical objects that are connected to a network of some kind, some sort of electrical network, that has a CPU and memory, actually encompasses a huge range of devices. Your printer is IoT, right? Under that definition, your laptop, your a car, a tank is IoT. And so, just from the outset, the definition is difficult. Second is that a lot of the things that we conceive of as IoT is actually an ecosystem of technology. So most IoT, people think of it as just the device, but it's not, right? There is also a network that it is transmitting information to. There is also the cloud storage that many of the devices are uploading data to. There's the mobile app that you command and control, or manage and control your device. And there are vulnerabilities at each stage of every stage of that process. So it's not just a piece of hardware that we're looking at. It is really an ecosystem. And it is one reason why some folks cast doubt, and I think reasonably so, on this concept of IoT security. Like, is there really an Internet of Things, or is it just computer security?
Yeah, so I think that's right. And coming from NIST, where everything likes to be defined and standardized, that's sort of what we do. We get this question a lot about what does IoT mean, and is there a definition? Especially when in other areas, when there was a bit of a gap, NIST did come in and provide a definition. So cloud computing is an example. When that term came out, people wasn't really sure what it meant, and for some people said, well, I already have a server that has a lot of data on it. Does that mean I have cloud computing? So in that instance, it was somewhere where we came in and put out a notional definition that ended up being one that everyone likes and is now used throughout the world. And on IoT, we haven't done that. Instead, we've sort of referred to existing definitions and looked at particular use cases. Because I think, building off what Harley said, I think one of the challenges we have here is there are good ways to look at it both horizontally and vertically. And what I mean by that is, what are the attributes of generic IoT devices? What are the, as Harley said, computer security, right? What are we thinking about it? Particularly when people that are building products don't necessarily want to build a product and say, okay, here's how it would be used in the financial sector in this use case, and here's how it would be used in the healthcare sector. And that would be the vertical, right? Because is it appropriate to look at IoT from that broad horizontal, which is what are the generic properties, when in some instances I might want to have different security protocols on the security camera in my son's room versus my heart monitor or my car, right? It just makes sense that you might want to think about those differently. So those are some of the challenges in how we address this and how we think about IoT as a broader set of policies.
Thanks. I think another thing to think about is we went from not every home having a large desktop computer to now more than 4 devices per home. So one of the ways that we think about this is the so-called attack surface has increased exponentially. And so in order for us to gain the benefits that we've heard about and you will hear about today, we need to be able to secure those devices to ensure that we continue to trust in those devices. So there was a large attack that people have said is sort of what prompted what we're about to talk about next a little bit. But I don't want to bore you with the details. We have enough fear, uncertainty, and doubt. You can open the newspaper and read about whichever company was most recently the victim of malicious or malign cyber activity. So what's being done about this exponentially increasing attack surface? There are lots of things that are being done. I thought it would be useful for us to, since we're in DC, frame the conversation a little bit around what the executive branch is doing. And I'm going to turn to Adam first to talk about what's being done under an executive order that was issued in 2017, which is, if you're writing this down, it's EO 13800. It was the most recent executive order in a series of executive orders. Another one that Adam may or may not talk about is EO 13636, which again, I'm talking also to the students in the room if you have to write a paper or if you're watching online, taking notes. These are little guide points to help you. So I think we'll begin with that and then kind of branch out from there and maybe get into some of the details about what this executive order did, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what came before it, but I didn't tell you about that beforehand, so put you on the spot.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to bore you with some of the details on these things. Looking back on how some of these policies have been developed and are being developed, just a bit about my background is I actually worked in the Senate Homeland Security Governmental Affairs Committee from 2001 to 2010. So I actually saw this become sort of a topic that cybersecurity or information security as a topic that wasn't of interest to many of the members. They thought it was this kind of weird, dull topic, to something that is debated every day, multiple bills mentioned in addresses by presidents. And one of the transitions that I witnessed there, and I think how it became really of interest to policymakers, and this is just cybersecurity generically, was the conversation around critical infrastructure and the idea that this greater connectivity of things that were designed without concepts of it being connected to this global information network, all of a sudden were being connected. And what did that mean, and what was the impact of that? So the scenarios of electric grids being subject to remote attacks became something that really made members of Congress sit up straight and say, well, this is really something we need to do something about. And Megan mentioned Executive Order 13636. I mean, the focus there was largely on this conversation of critical infrastructure. But I think if you look increasingly at the policies that came after that, we sort of moved from critical infrastructure and it just broadens out bit by bit to more and more. Right? You had the Sony attack, where people had to ask themselves, well, that's not really critical infrastructure, is it? But that's something that feels pretty important to us as a country. And then increasingly you had attacks on these major cybersecurity companies that impacted consumers. So really, if you just look at the set of policies coming out of the Obama administration now into the Trump administration, it's sort of reflecting that this isn't something that's just segmented just to critical infrastructure, just to businesses. It really has the broader consumer interest in mind, and that's really where we get at IoT, which does impact enterprises and governments, but it also has this direct impact on the consumer in a way that these other ones didn't, because you have to work directly with the consumer instead of just working with electric providers or big financial companies. And so one of the reasons why we talk about the ecosystem so much is that it's an increased realization that you can't just impact, you just can't work with one node, work with one part of this much bigger system. How that manifests itself in policy and the executive orders that Megan mentioned was, Executive Order 1300 asked for a report that we call the botnet report.
What's a botnet?
Yeah, I'm getting there. But also was about what they call automated distributed attacks. And so people also refer to botnets almost as zombie computers, so big networks of computing power that are then used for various purposes. And the particular incident that Megan was talking about was something called the Mirai botnet, which really harnessed a lot of consumer security cameras to have something with a lot of compute power, which then could be used for denial of service or other, which means that you would be preventing people from getting on the internet or for other purposes. The reason why I think that's a good example for this IoT device, for this IoT conversation, is it's really at the nature of the problem. Does a consumer necessarily care if their perfectly well-functioning security camera is being part of a botnet when it doesn't impact how the security camera is to them? From their perspective, the security camera is working just fine. They're getting the information they need. So maybe it's doing this other stuff on the side. I don't have anything to do with that. And then is the consumer, if he goes in the store and says, would they necessarily be willing to pay more money for a security camera that wouldn't be subject to that bot if it, again, is delivering them the service they need, if it serves that function? I mean, these are some of the really challenging questions that we have to ask ourselves when we were trying to solve this problem. What the executive order did was it tasked the Departments of Commerce and Department of Homeland Security to work with stakeholders to develop a plan, realizing that there are a lot of different dependencies here, and just focusing on individual devices might not be the most effective solution. And also looking back, taking some recommendations from an independent commission that came at the end of the Obama administration, and looking at why hasn't the federal government, working with industry, been able to make progress on these issues in the past. And the conclusion was sort of a lack of sustained effort, right? You sort of started and stopped, you thought about it, and then you moved on to a problem without trying to really commit, understanding that It's not just one organization or one set of companies moving. It really requires people to act in a coordinated fashion. And the reason why I say that is because when we talk about IoT, there tends to be a lot of focus on the security of the individual devices, right? How do I make those security cameras more secure? How do I make my phones more secure? What we're trying to do in the botnet report and with these other efforts is try to address it at multiple levels, understanding that there are some dependencies there and then there are some additional vulnerabilities. So an example of that would be, I'll use the security camera example again. If you did make the extra money, if you paid the extra amount of money, if you did get a device that you understood had greater security and then you took it home and it asked you to create a login and password and you decided to make your login, and your password, then you have undermined a lot of the security settings of the devices. So we're trying to think about it not just from the individual devices, but also consumer education so that they understood what to do, what additional resources they might have. And also at the network level, understanding that we already have a lot of these devices out there. A lot of them aren't going to have good security capabilities. So what are the other things that we can do to better understand what's happening across the network to try to make the entire ecosystem a lot more secure? So that work under the executive order led us to draft a report. The report's been out for a little over a year now, I think. Okay. One of the things that we changed, and we tend to do these things through an open and transparent process where we try to make sure that everyone has the same information we have as we're making these conclusions. So we do it through workshops, we do it through public submissions, so if people are curious how individual organizations submitted comments, what they look like and what we did with them, they can sort of look over our shoulder and make sure we did that in a fair and equitable way. And one of the things we did at the end of the report is not just, which really looks at it in different arenas and also gives out sort of different homework assignments to different parts of industry, things that we should do, things that they should do, things that other departments and agencies should do. And then one of the last things we did as we moved the document from draft to final, we also gave ourselves a requirement to sort of check in after a year, understanding some of the conclusions of the commission were, the government seems to be starting these things and then stopping. So in some ways, again, we're grading our own homework to a certain extent, but we will be coming out with a report in October to show how much different.
Thank you. So there was a report and then there was a roadmap that followed. I think that was published near the end of November of last year. And it had basically 5 lines of effort. Enterprises, and so I think as we get into this conversation, it'd be helpful for us to, we're talking in our language, making sure that we talk about it in everyone's language. What's an enterprise? It can be, it's the .gov, mail.house.gov network that we're sitting in, under which we're probably sitting, although it's probably also in a cloud. It's in hopefully lots of different places, so there's redundancy. Infrastructure, we talked a little bit about critical infrastructure, the power companies and other things, and it can also be infrastructure such as ISPs, those who operate the internet backbone. Tech development and transition, we probably won't spend too much time talking about that, but among other things, we're talking about research that the government can do for its own purposes that then could be transitioned out to the private sector. And then education and awareness. So I think it would be helpful for us to spend a little bit of time talking about what is being done in the roadmap space and how that can specifically impact social change and marginalized communities. And I think another way to think about this is we have this IoT camera, baby camera, security camera. It might be a 3D printer in other cases. These devices are deployed. I have some in my house. Please don't hack them. But they are all over the place. They are, I think, most prominently in small and medium-sized businesses. And so, Dr. Esser, when we had our prep call, we talked a little about small and medium-sized businesses and micro businesses. And I think it would be helpful for us to kind of frame our minds today around, particularly as a result of IoT deployment, how these devices impact communities, particularly marginalized communities. And maybe you can give a little bit more example or drill a little bit down on what might an enterprise be to those who are not, it's not mail.house.gov, but maybe it's the small business down the street.
Right. So it's really that corporate infrastructure, right, that we talked about. So when we talk about,
Could it be a maker shop, maybe?
if they are connected to a larger organization, absolutely, and that organization is its own entity as well, so absolutely. So I think, so it's been interesting for me the past 3 years that I've been in this higher ed, educational training awareness space. I've had quite a bit of folks reaching out to me, especially small and medium-sized businesses and micro businesses, which are a subset to small businesses, right? And, you know, when you think of small business and you think of micro businesses, right, we live in this gig economy. I think we've heard that term quite a bit, right? Where folks got multiple jobs and they're probably interacting with businesses that are small businesses or they're micro businesses. Micro businesses tend to be an organization, a business that has less than 5 employees, right? And that one employee is probably the owner itself and 4 additional employees, right? And their startup, so to speak, monies tend to be low capital, right? And they also have traditionally low revenue, well, not low, but about $250,000 in revenue that they bring in. So, but they are the backbone, right, of our society. If we think about everything from the food trucks outside, right, to you know, our local shops around our communities, to many of the small businesses and micro businesses. So I'm a computer science person. So sorry, math is my background. I love bringing in stats. So just reading this is just a 2016 small business credit survey, and it talked about 89% of the small businesses are actually micro businesses, believe it or not. The median age of typically for micro businesses are 46 to 55 years old. So already right there, we're dealing with a little bit of a gap, right? When we talk about technology, when folks talk about technological natives versus those who are from that persuasion, right? Who are technically not natives, right? To, of course, the millennials, right? Which are considered technological natives, right? And then percent of these firms are also minority owned. 30% are actually micro businesses are minority owned. So when you talk about cyber threats and you talk about IoT, you talk about devices, many of these micro businesses and small businesses, because they are part of the supply chain, right, of many of these companies, they're independent contractors, consultants, so forth, they are using technology very quickly. So they are adopting technology without understanding probably the cybersecurity impacts, noting that unfortunately, if they are hit with a threat, right, or if they compromise in some way, that could be detrimental to their company, right, could completely wipe them out. So there's been just a lot of momentum behind assisting organizations and businesses that are kind of at the backbone of our society, but unfortunately are not equipped with the infrastructure and the resources, right, to identify and mitigate any of the cyber threats. So it's been something being reached out by a lot of startups saying, help me in cybersecurity. I got this great app, or I got this great service, a great product, but I don't understand the cybersecurity implications and I need help with that. So yes, definitely.
Carly, I feel like we're not bringing you into the conversation enough, so feel free to chime in, but otherwise I'll quickly turn to Adam, and maybe it's a good point to talk about. So again, we're talking about some of the challenges. What are we doing about, how are we addressing these challenges? We've talked about the roadmap there, and we mentioned the 5 elements. I think it's also useful for perhaps Adam to talk a little bit about the privacy implications and how NIST is helping developing tools to help everyone in the ecosystem, but primarily through a trickle-down effect, primarily industry and the government, to think about the privacy implications of deployed technologies. But before we get to the privacy implications, you talked briefly about the CS 13636, which spawned the cybersecurity framework. So maybe we can touch on that and then talk a little bit about the intersection of CSF and the privacy framework. Did it come out?
Yeah, it's out.
So one of the things I'm hoping you can maybe speak to is how, I mentioned the trickle-down effect. So if you're a small company and you're like, I see lots of references to ISO standards and things, and that's not my game. How might micro businesses see the effects of that, or how could they perhaps ask of their, Google you're pretty good with, but if you're going with your local cloud backup storage guys, how can you better position yourself?
Sure. Okay, it's a lot. I'll take it bit by bit.
Yes.
So back in So just a bit about NIST, and we're about a 100-year organization, so I won't go too far back. But historically, how we worked was developing standards and guidelines for federal information systems, right? And that means that for if you're working Department of Treasury, you work Department of State, and you are using a technology and you're not sure how to configure it or use it, you have to turn to NIST, and NIST will help you provide that guide. And a lot of that was developed so that, that method, and the broader way in which NIST has worked in the standard space is sort of to solve this problem of how does the government effectively use technology, and how do we stop building our own stuff. So, for example, I think it was only a year or two ago that the Department of Defense stopped building their own phones, right? So you go out, you write a spec, and you say, this is how I want my phone to look with the security capabilities. And that historically creates real challenges because, of course, that requires the Department of Defense or whatever government agency to keep on going out with procurements and requests. And if industry is moving faster than that, wouldn't it be easier just for the federal government just to get a phone from Apple, and if there are additional, or Samsung or whoever, and if there are additional security capabilities that they need, make sure that it's configured in that way. So that's sort of at the heart of what we have done, and a lot of it is to prevent it's a very similar approach in other areas to prevent things like a $250 custom DoD ashtray. And the reason why we've been effective in that space is because the federal government is still the largest procurer of information technology in the world, right? We spend about $90 billion. And so if you want to sell to the federal government, you want to work with NIST because you want to make sure that the capability of your products are being reflected in that. But increasingly, as more people use technology, the people that make the technologies might not care about selling to the federal government when they can make sufficient money just selling to consumers. And they might not want to go through those additional hoops. And so we've thought about our approach a lot differently because also the needs and how the federal government uses technology is increasingly pretty similar to how just companies use technology. It used to be that people would go and try to get jobs in the federal government because they got to use cool technology. I don't think anyone's saying that nowadays. We get to use MacBooks, and we always are looked at jealously by our colleagues in other departments and agencies because their technology folks haven't figured out how to do that in a secure way. And so part of our work, so this is a long build-up, and Megan's probably rolling her eyes, but part of where this took us a few years ago was with something that was called the Cybersecurity Framework. And this was really focused on industry's needs, particularly critical infrastructure. And what policymakers were really struggling with was the idea that there were a ton of best practices out there were tons of standards and guidelines out there, and they couldn't figure out why organizations just weren't using them. And so instead of choosing an approach where we just said, well, we're just going to require everyone to use them, we actually had a dialogue to try to understand where some of the gaps were, where some of the challenges were, and figure out how to work better with them to address those challenges. And in cybersecurity, it really did seem to break down to some challenges with communication, and also some breaks between different sectors and how they communicate cybersecurity risk, which became an increasing problem as technology exploded and more people were relying on more technology. So it used to be that industry might have come to us and said, you guys are the government, we're the private sector, we move faster than you are, we feel pretty good about what we do, we don't really need your help. But even 5 years ago, instead they were coming to us to say, hey, we're pretty confident in what we do, we hire really good people, but I'm dependent on the telecommunications industry, on the internet, I'm dependent on the energy industry for my power, I'm dependent on all these different sectors and different organizations, and I don't know what the heck they're doing, and I don't know how to help them improve their game. And so where the framework came out was really a tool to help people communicate what they were doing in cybersecurity, both within their organization and externally, and try to go up to the highest level as just a simple communications tool, and then provide a guide to more detailed implementation guidance. So that if you were having a conversation about cybersecurity from the CEO level, you could look at the highest level of the cybersecurity framework, which are words like identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. And you could say, I don't need to know how we're doing it, but under identify, do we know where our risks are? Do we know where our vulnerabilities are? Under detect, do we understand when there is an incident, when a bad thing is happening? Protect, are we using technology to make sure that we're protected? And then respond and recover, understanding that there will be incidents, that there will be bad days. It might be as simple as someone leaving their laptop on the train. Do we have the right processes to make sure that we're getting back on and recover, which is not just the immediate crisis, but longer term, how do we make sure that we're operating better and delivering services in the way we're intended to? And so that's where the cybersecurity framework came out. It's been, I think, used very widely through industry beyond what we ever expected. And not just by critical infrastructure companies, tech companies, financial firms. A lot of regulators have referred to it as a good practice, so a lot of companies use it that way, and we also see it internationally because other governments were grappling with the same problems, and they said, well, this seemed like a pretty effective approach. So it's not just used here in the US, it's used in